Well, thank you very much, Humphrey. Thank you, Robin. One of the issues that's raised in the publicity for today's meeting is the question of a US or South Korean president possibly withdrawing from a prior agreement made by a previous administration. This is a pertinent issue. We've seen it with the demise of the earlier Sunshine Policy when a Liberal administration gave way to a Conservative one in Seoul. And we certainly saw relevant examples with the Trump administration, like the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, or the Paris Climate Change Accord, or the UN World Health Organization. And of course, we've seen it previously in the history of US relations with the DPRK. The October 1994 Agreed Framework Agreement entered into by President Clinton, which Humphrey referenced in his opening remarks, suffered delays and prevarication only to be repudiated and replaced by axis of evil rhetoric by President George W. Bush. So historically, that fear has mostly been associated with the possible actions by a Republican incumbent regarding the work of his Democrat predecessor. But today, we may face the situation of the overturn of a standpoint and actions, if not an actual deal, of a Republican predecessor by his Democrat successor. There was, of course, no actual deal concluded by the US and the DPRK as a result of the unprecedented meetings between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un in Singapore, Hanoi, and Panmunjom. Now, that may have been a product of Trump's lack of diplomatic experience or his somewhat inflated view of his own deal-making abilities, but more especially, it seems clear to me that it resulted from the obstruction and perhaps outright wrecking of his efforts by key members of his own team at the time, such as John Bolton. Be that as it may, the Democrats attacked these meetings at the time and during the presidential election campaign. President Biden has presented the idea of a possible meeting with Kim Jong-un as some sort of unilateral favor to be possibly bestowed by the US. And needless to say, this interpretation is not one that is shared in Pyongyang. And of course, the current US president has also described Kim Jong-un as a thug, but he's made quite colorful references to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping as well, of course. President Biden has, however, not completely ruled out the possibility of a meeting with Kim Jong-un, but he has said that such a meeting can only be contemplated once the DPRK has taken steps to disarm. To me, this rather overlooks the fact that negotiations are generally held with a view to reaching agreements, not after agreements have been reached. So I think it's against this background that we should look at the DPRK's attitude towards the discrete approaches made by the Biden administration to the DPRK through a number of channels, including the well-established UN channel in New York and via an unnamed third country. And the DPRK has set out its current position in two statements from what I've dubbed two leading ladies in DPRK diplomacy. The first, as many of you know, was issued on March 16 by Kim Yo-jong, the younger sister of Kim Jong-un. And whilst most Western commentary focused mainly on Ms. Kim's remarks regarding the US, these actually accounted for just two short sentences towards the end of her quite lengthy statement, which focused overwhelmingly on the question of relations with South Korea. But her admonition that the Biden administration had, quote, better refrain from causing a stink at its first step, clearly had the Seoul visit of Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Secretary Austin in mind. Now, this statement was followed 2 days later, on March 18th, by one from Choi Son-hui, the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, which did explicitly focus on the US. Confirming those various approaches, she stated, "We have already declared our stand that no DPRK-US contact and dialogue of any kind can be possible unless the US rolls back its hostile policy towards the DPRK. Therefore, we will disregard such an attempt of the US in the future too. We make it clear that we won't give it such opportunities as in Singapore and Hanoi again." And she concluded, "We already clarified that we will counter the US on the principle of power for power and goodwill for goodwill." Now, naturally, diplomacy, especially on the Korean Peninsula, is a complex dance. And Ms. Choi's remarks earlier this month should not necessarily be taken as the DPRK's final word. It would be quite wrong, however, not to regard them as significant. Nor should her remarks be taken as a simple or absolute rejection of meetings and dialogue. In fact, in a careful reading of her statement, one can identify repeated expressions of a willingness to sit and talk under certain circumstances and conditions. But she nevertheless affirms that the DPRK is presently not interested, not simply in low-level exchanges with the US, but even in meetings of the Singapore and Hanoi type, which they apparently see as not geared towards a realistic and equitable agreement, but rather more for affording photo opportunities to the US. Of course, in the West, these meetings are habitually presented as affording the exact opposite opportunity. But it is important to appreciate how the other side sees things. You don't have to agree with them, but a failure to understand is, in my view, rarely useful. In asserting that meetings like those held in Singapore and Hanoi are no longer good enough, the DPRK has set the bar, or I would say its opening gambit, rather high. And it's pretty clear to me that the approaches from the Biden administration will be setting the bar rather low, both in terms of the level for any possible dialogue, at least at the first stages, and in terms of possible preconditions. So what we have apparently at the moment is a scissors gap that needs to be narrowed. And in conclusion, I would say therefore that the current prospects for a diplomatic breakthrough do not seem very positive to me. This is therefore something for civil society also to ponder over and try to assess what can be done. The extensive and imaginative program currently being developed and rolled out around the world by our friends in the UPF will hopefully be able to make a significant and positive impact in this regard. Thank you.